Until we get rid of that thought process and say we're all in it together, which sounds hokey, but it's true.
Yeah.
Then we're gonna be.
Well, that's kind of the definition of a nation. You know, Hello. Welcome to the Call Like I See It podcast. I'm James Keys, and in this episode of Call Like I See It, we're going to discuss the tens of billions in federal child care funds that just shut off in the month of October, and how this is putting a downstream squeeze on everything down the road, on local economies and in the aggregate national economies with the loss of these child care funds. And also we'll touch on the role of government in something like childcare and providing assistance or whatever with childcare. And later on, we're going to discuss masculinity being under assault, and the interesting fact that it seems like people always feel like masculinity is under assault, and maybe masculinity is always under assault. So we'll explore that as well. Joining me today is a man who knows how to keep things rolling all day and all night. Tunde Ogunlana. Tunde, are you ready to show him how you do your best work in scary hours?
Yeah, man.
All right.
Got to be sure I do it in a masculine way, right?
That's the only way, man. That's the only way.
We'll talk about that. Let's see.
All right. Now, we're recording this on October 31st, 2023. And at the end of September, the last month from now, but you know, it's September, the end of September 2023, we saw tens of billions of dollars in federal funding for childcare expire. Now, this funding was allocated as emergency funding as part of the pandemic era America Rescue Plan Act. And this loss of funding, though, that's happening right now is believed that's going to affect hundreds of thousands of childcare centers and over 3 million children. And many have speculated, /worried, /raised alarm, or called it a crisis with respect to not just the loss of childcare and what that does to families and everything, but also the downstream effects. And, you know, if people have to work less or, you know, leave the economy, so to speak, in order to care for their own children, then that will lessen economic activity for all of us, which is not necessarily our objective in trying to grow an economy. So, Tunde, I want to start with the expiration of the program, and then we can move on to the downstream effects and also touch on the role of government. So just to get us started, what's your thought, you know, just what comes to mind or what stands out to you as far as the expiration of this federal funding on childcare?
It's interesting, something that I don't think about every day. So it's an interesting topic for us to touch on. And so when I started really thinking about preparing for the discussion, I thought, okay, what is it? What's the symbolism of something like that? And I would say, obviously, we're going to get into the weeds a little bit more about this type of funding, why it was created recently, and like you said, the potential economic impacts of it dwindling. But on the 30,000 foot level to start, I just thought, so like, what does a budget really say about a government? And it really spells out the priorities of said government, in whichever society or country you're in. And so when I thought about, you know, I think this year, our fiscal year, the U.S.
So this year, as in the one that started October 1st, or?
Correct.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so the one we did, the fiscal year we're entering right now, yeah.
Yeah, is, you know, we're looking at about a $6 trillion plus U.S. budget. So, you know, yeah, $39 billion in early childhood education and childcare support is already a small drop in the bucket when you look at the size of that budget.
Yeah.
So what it got me thinking was just like, you know, okay, and this is what I'm saying to anyone that might look at what I'm saying negative is I'm actually just saying this in a neutral way. It shows the priority or lack thereof of looking out for the early education of the future generation of Americans. Mm-hmm. That's what we think about it in comparison to a $900 billion military budget, or the budget for elderly Americans through entitlements like Social Security and Medicare. That's well over, you know, probably $1.5 trillion combined. Mm-hmm. So that doesn't mean that I'm detracting from our need to spend on the military or to take care of senior citizens. I'm not trying to say it's a zero sum either or in that way. What I'm just saying
no, it's just observing the priority. Like, yeah, exactly. Observing that
we're not spending $200 billion on early childhood education or $500 billion. We're not. It's a drop in the bucket compared to other priorities that we have. So that's kind of what stuck out to me. And then the last piece is that 93% of voters, according to the article, support some sort of early childhood education. So it seems like an imbalance between what the voters support and where we spend the money.
Well, I mean, and that's, I think the public and private aspect of this has to be looked at. And that's really, to me, that's what made me want to investigate more, so to speak. That's what I wanted to read more in, like, well, why is it necessary for the government, or why is it important? You know, not important. Necessary is a better word, actually, for the government to have to do this. And to learn that it's pretty well established that from an early childhood education, it's not something that the private sector, it's not something that's desirable for the private sector. It's not a profit generating exercise. If you want to charge what you need to charge in order to make it a for-profit thing where you can make money on it, then people can't afford it. So the biggest issue that we have, the core issue that we have, is that in order to do it to the level it needs to be done, it's going to cost too much for people to be able to afford it. And so you have this disconnect there. And so that's why the government would step in that type of situation. Not much different than the fact that there's nothing saying that private companies can't build roads, for themselves, just, hey, we just want to build roads, but it's not something that they would be able to charge enough typically to make that something that they can make money on, make profit on. And so therefore private companies are not incentivized to do it. And so if we have a situation that we observe and we all can agree on, that childcare is not something that private companies by and large can get into and make money doing, if they're going to be able to charge what they would need to charge, then yes, there's something for the government there. If we value it, to your point, if we value it, if 93% of the people think that we should have it, and voters wise or whatever, then there should be something that the government's kicking in from that. And that's not to say the government is not putting anything in right now. What we're looking at now is the loss of what was considered emergency funding that was put forward during the pandemic. And so to me, just what stands out about it, with it expiring, it's just like, okay, like you said, we're shifting our priorities. We no longer believe through our representative democracy, no longer believe that it's important for this that this emergency funding is needed. And we're willing to shoulder the consequences of that. And that's what we're going to see now. And that's what, we'll have some stuff in the show notes, but there's a lot of people talking about all the consequences for this. And I want to get to that with you as well, just the effects that this will have on the economy. And then if you have any other comments, but I do want to keep us moving to, just kind of, where do you see as far as how this is going to affect the economy? Are you as concerned as some who, we've seen the word crisis be used, oh, this is a crisis, the childcare, yada, yada, yada. And the lack of affordable the lack of affordable childcare is a 5-alarm fire issue that we just aren't paying enough attention to.
Yeah, I think the economic effects that can be felt might be more localized in some communities. Reading a good article about how it might affect people in our backyard, here in South Florida. Mm-hmm. And, they were pretty specific in the article, certain parts of Miami-Dade County, specifically how much they are able to take in, how many people they can hire in these child centers, so on and so forth. So, obviously, yeah, if you pull back $39 billion of spend, we know that it's going to have some sort of effect at the ground level. And
people that aren't being hired means people that aren't, getting jobs. And so that's a direct.
Right, so that's what I mean about the ramifications of the potential for economic impact. I think that'll be felt at a more local level. And probably that's what I was going to say. We have a $24-25 trillion annual kind of GDP growth in our economy. Like I said, the government spends $6 trillion plus a year. So 39 billion, will it have an effect on the economy that we'll all feel? Probably not. But will it affect certain regions and pockets more than others? Yeah. There's certain, I was just curious about, okay, what's going on in our state? We received $7 billion of that aid. So clearly the out of 39 billion, to learn that we're getting, almost 20% of that, tells you that out of 50 states, it's pretty lopsided where the spend is going. So it will affect maybe Florida economy a little bit more than maybe a state that's not getting anything or barely a drop in the bucket. So yeah in that sense,
especially with Florida being, a state that has a lot of hospitality and things like that, where, that there's nothing going on as far as either assistance with childcare or even where people typically make enough to afford good childcare and things like that within those types of industries.
That's where we can see the ramifications of the economic effect, like you're saying, of single moms that may not be able to work as much, or even two-parent households where maybe one spouse needs to now stop their job because they can't get the assistance with the early childhood care. I think that's one example of the now, like the next year or two, maybe how it affects things. But I think we should also, if we're thinking about this as we're all sharing this nation together, we're all trying to move it forward together, what's the real impact long-term by having a continued kind of drought in spending on education in general on the future of American citizens, right? So that's what I'm just saying is there's probably a greater economic impact if you just figure we're going to have less kids that are learning early, which means less chance for those kids to be more productive when they're older in certain ways. Maybe, mathematics, engineering, things like that.
Yeah, that's actually my biggest thought on this is the fact that we don't really know the larger effects. Like you pointed out, the direct effects, like, okay, this childcare center is going to close. So, there's going to be people losing jobs or whatever, or they won't expand, they won't hire. So instead of planning to hire 3 more people in the next 6 months, they're not planning to hire any. Those are the things we can measure to some reasonable, certainty. But what we can't measure is all the opportunity that's lost. And that's usually one step away. More downstream is, okay, well, this is the business. These are the businesses that didn't get started because like you said, it could be single parent or 2-parent households where, one of the parents wasn't able to have the time to start a business because they weren't able to afford childcare. Or to your point, these are the kids that are not getting ahead, so to speak, to then, chart a trajectory to be the next innovator or something important in our society that'll move us forward in the future. So it's the loss of opportunity, I think, that really stands out. But because that's hard to quantify, that's even hard to conceptualize. You can understand why it becomes less of a priority. But I do want to drill down a little bit more on the affordability piece, and this is just to connect what I was saying before. As far as to do early childhood education, it appears that in order to pay the people and have the facilities, you would have to charge an amount that people can't pay. And so this affordability gap, to me, when we're in a time of high inflation right now, relative to the last 30 years or so, right now, inflation is relatively high. And so that squeeze on, and I think it was very important that you noted that a lot of times when we talk about this, people in their minds automatically think about, oh, well, this is a single mom thing. And then that brings in baggage. A lot of times people are like, oh, well, maybe, if the single mom was, either, or if the dad was still there, then we as a society wouldn't have to step in and be providing more for them or, whatever. But the way, like the kind of thing that a lot of people have in their minds where you have 2 parents and, and everything like that. And the single earner thing we know is gone, like that was there 50, 60 years ago, but that's gone now. For the most part, when you have 2 parents in a household, both parents are working, generally speaking, on kind of your median type of level. And so when you're looking at affordability, it's not just that people are having more kids that they can afford, so to speak. It's that what is affordable is running away from us, as a society. And so on a governmental level, the government needs to do something about that. Now, if the government doesn't want to do something about that with direct payments and say, hey, we'll cut checks for something, then ideally what the government would be doing is things that address the system more to try to keep inflation under control. And that's what we see, like you've talked about before, with the Federal Reserve trying to, raising interest rates makes other things expensive, but it is trying to keep inflation under control. So all of the different, my point ultimately is that there's a lot of different mechanisms going on, or a lot of different things going on, a lot of different mechanisms that can be used to try to turn this up or turn that down, or react to this or react to that. And this is just one of them. But here, it seems like, whether by conscious decision or the fact that it's just not much is happening in Congress right now, we made a call here, an act of our own mission, that this is not something that we're going to prioritize, and we're going to basically face the costs. And if this costs us in the future, then it costs us in the future, and that's the road we're on.
Yeah. Well, remember, defunding the IRS is going on.
Well, but that
Make
to your,
sure,
but
well, no,
I
that's
wanted to
actually
mention
good
this.
because that'll make sure these kids don't pay taxes in the future. So maybe that's
If they don't earn anything.
more,
Well,
maybe
but
that's
this
more
is
important than early childhood education.
well, but the affordability gap, but this is actually, and then I did want to mention this briefly, and then we can move to the next section. But like, this is the kind of stuff that we want Congress debating about, because I don't think there is any easy solution. Like, it's not a permanent solution to just say government just keep writing checks forever, increasingly amount, you know, as if we have an affordability gap on something that if 93% of the people think is important, then we need Congress trying to figure out how to address that. And this is the problem that we have when it's all about, you know, Congress is about playing games right now for the most part, you know, like, and it's, or if culture war stuff dominates people's imaginations and dominates their energy, and it's like, oh, we got to ban books and we got to do all this stuff. And it's like, well, there's actual real issues that we need the government to try to be looking at and addressing. And if everybody's too worried about critical race theory, then this is the stuff. This stuff isn't that exciting, you know, like, this doesn't get people's passions going and doesn't get people, you know, like, they're really fired up and wake up in the morning and can't wait to see what they say on the news the next day about it. And so this is the kind of stuff, though, that falls by the wayside when people are focused on some of these other things that, you know, that may get them more excited.
Yeah, no, it's true, man.
Yeah. So, but all right, we've seen, you know, it be presented or argued even that, and to your point, as far as the you know, the priorities of the government, but that our government essentially discourages people from having kids. And we have an opinion piece we'll put in the show notes on. And so it's discouraging citizens from having kids by the way it orders its priorities and so forth. So what do you think, just if, and again, not necessarily, this is more so like your own kind of opinion in this, the government's role should be in, you know, like, obviously you are a free market person by and large. I mean, you're not a you know, everybody do what they want, no regulation, free market. But I'm a person saying we should try to use market forces to address things when possible. So what do you think the role of a government like ours should be with something like this, where we have this affordability gap with early child care, and, you know, we have the issue of lots of kids needing it?
Yeah, well, that's a great question to put me on the spot. No, it's good. It's funny. Like, you know, I rarely get asked that question directly. What's my real opinion about the role of government in these things?
Yeah. Well, no, that's to your point, though. But to your point, I'll filibuster for you a little bit while you think. But a lot of times, but a lot of times, though, what you have is people just complain about stuff, and oh, the way it is messed up. The way it is messed up. But it's like, okay, well, what do you think it should be? And that's really what I want to get to is here. Okay, like, let's not talk about what's messed up, or let's not talk like, but what do you think is something that would be workable, so to speak?
Yeah. No, I mean, this is a great question, because therein lies the messiness of a democracy, right? Because if I were to say what's my personal opinion, and then I'll get a little bit outside of my own opinion, it's a good question. I mean, I think the way you framed it earlier actually is the way I would look at a lot of these discussions about the role of government and the quasi-socialistic side of things versus the pure capitalism side of things. So, for example, like you said, it would be cost prohibitive for most people in the citizenry and not profitable for a business, meaning the two couldn't meet for it to work successfully.
Yeah.
Meaning
for the market to address it directly.
Childhood, correct. The early childhood education en masse to make sure most American kids get a decent education, so we can all live in a country with people that are relatively educated in the future, so on and so forth, right? Well, if businesses can't make enough money where they may have to be subsidized anyway, meaning taxpayer dollars got to be spent to subsidize for-profit corporations, and or if the private sector was allowed to do it in order to be profitable, the rank and file American couldn't afford it, then to me, there's a disconnect. There's room for that conversation. And that's why I would say I'll compare it to the fire station, police, general public school, the military, right? Things that as individuals we may not be able to afford on our own, but that are important in either keeping us protected or keeping us safe, whether from, you know, invasion from foreign countries or home and law enforcement on our streets, keeping fires from burning down neighborhoods, right? like these are all things that we've decided are in the public interest to be of shared cost,
Yeah.
and of shared expense, so that just because 2 or 3 people can't afford it in said neighborhood or group doesn't mean the whole neighborhood's at risk because now the services can't be provided. And I think that's what I go back to in my first answer from today's show, which is, what are our priorities as a nation? So that's where I think you're right. The role of government, how does government enter this conversation? I think that's where, then going back to the idea, we have a democracy, like you said, the deliberative body we're supposed to debate these things is Congress, which doesn't appear to be spending its time debating these things. It's debating other things and behaving in ways that are just different, right?
But yeah, things that you and I might consider trivial in many respects,
Yeah, and the last piece I'll say, and then I'll hand it back, is you mentioned things like critical race theory, and that got me thinking about the attacks we've had from just our regular ecosystem and media on our school system specifically in recent years, just the last 3-4 years, I think have made a lot of Americans apathetic, and is also about our school system and educating kids, meaning you and I are parents.
The collective educating the kids, like, hey, let's all, yeah.
That's what I was gonna say. You and I are parents,
I mean, you could say apathetic or you could say hostile.
And that's what I'm getting at is as individuals, you and I care deeply about the education of our own kids. And everyone does. That's what I'm saying. I don't want someone sitting here watching us saying, oh man, I care about my kids. What are you talking about? Of course, each individual watching this with children cares about their children. But that goes back to what I'm saying is the danger of this type of rhetoric in our society now about education and the misinformation about, kids are going to be learning, taking the drag, shows on their field trips, for example. And that scares people into wanting to fund public education and support teachers, so on and so forth. So I think there's a lot of just kind of muddiness out there on the topic, and I think that it's like I said, that's kind of what a democracy looks like. We need to retake control of the narrative of what does it mean to educate the future of American kids.
Yeah, because what you're pointing out is that what that kind of hostility makes people want to kind of retreat to their own corners and not engage in more of a collective, like, hey, let's bring about the next generation, let's do this together, and it's kind of an important thing when you're putting a nation together or trying to build a nation, is that there is some level of collectivism. Like, we have to be in it together to some degree. And so the more people that kind of eject from the togetherness and say, hey, we'll just do it on our own, the harder it becomes to maintain a nation with shared interests and shared goals and so forth. But that's this conversation for another day. What were you gonna say?
But because it's interesting you say that, because number one, there's a lot of Americans that find, I think, in their mind, they look at certain European countries, and I'll name like Germany or Hungary, countries like that, and they look at them as models for how we should have our country set up. And one of the things that those countries do is they do heavy investments into early childhood education. And even Germany, I understand, has standardized tests when a kid's a teenager, like 15 or 16. And that kind of will put them in a path for a certain type of career. Like, you'll be better to be a plumber or an electrician. You'll be better to be an engineer. You'll be better to how you answer this test to be a medical doctor. And so my point is that that's the interesting thing with us in America, is the tension we have with central power, central authority of a government, or at least many Americans say they do until their side gets power. And what happens is, like you're saying it very astutely, is, well, we need some sort of collective agreement and a shared vision on how to deal, especially with things like childhood education. I mean, it's one thing to have the government involved in businesses and all that kind of stuff, but when you're talking about, like I said, military, firefighter, police, and education, those are things generally we've accepted that the greater society, has a say in, because of the collective need for the funding, right?
And the collective desire for things to go well for all of us in the future. Like, we kind of are all invested in making things better in the future.
And that's what I was going to say, is we see this happen, and again, the importance of teaching ourselves history in our own country. Usually we see these attacks on public education and how to deal with kids when there's these tensions in our culture, when there are demographic shifts and all that. So I'm thinking of a couple periods. First was maybe the Brown versus Board of Education period of the mid-late 50s into the early 60s, when you started seeing the attacks on integrating schools, and that's when you started seeing en masse private schools started to come up in the country, because now that one couldn't segregate in the public system anymore, a lot of parents felt that, hey, if I let my kid go to an integrated school, you know, in this case, white parents on that side of the argument, then they will have a diminished education and they'll have a diminished chance for their future. So I'm going to take them out of the system and put them in a private school. And then I think we saw it a decade later with the response to busing. It even heightened that kind of fear and those wedges even more. So
yeah. Well, no, I mean, just to get back to the kind of the thought, like I wanted to give my view on this as well, as far as what I think. And to me, I mean, the question, or kind of the issue that we're looking at, the problem is, I think, pretty straightforward, as you pointed out, and I talked about earlier. You know, in order to do it, you have to charge X amount. If you charge X amount, people can't afford it. So therefore, you can't do it because people can't pay you, and then you can't make money. You know, you can't be a profitable business. So private sector is going to come up short in addressing this need. So what do we do in our society when the private sector comes up short? Well, some of that depends on, there's another question involved there. Well, how important is it to us? And so, because there's many situations where either the private sector either cannot adequately take care of it, or in some cases just doesn't want to take care of it. You know, like, and I look at, you know, like when societies or you know, cities or counties or whatever decide to build, you know, multi-billion-dollar stadiums for sports teams. That's the time, you know, a lot of times the private sector may have the means to do it, but it's decided, hey, we're not going to build this stadium, or we want you guys to put in half of the money if we're going to do, you being the citizenry, you know, the local government and the state governments, to put in half of the money if we're going to do this, and so forth. So there are many examples, and unless kind of that one's kind of a toxic, or at least to some people, kind of a toxic view of it, of, you know, we're putting in hundreds of millions or $1 billion into funding a playground for a billionaire. But a less loaded one would just be, you know, like when you're building a high-rise downtown, you know, or something like that. A lot of times there is city or county or state participation in that, where, you know, to incentivize the state sees, and I'm going to say the state generally, meaning all of the kind of city, local municipality, county, whatever, but the state sees that there are downstream, there are immediate, there are direct benefits to the state in terms of being able to hire more. There'll be people being hired to build it, and then there'll be people that conceivably will work there. They're direct benefits for the local and you know, regional economy. And so they say, yeah, we want this high-rise built. And then there are downstream benefits. If we have more economic activity going on there, then there'll be economic activity around. And this applies to the stadiums too, at least how they're sold. Like, hey, if you put this stadium, you know, 8 times a year, all these 60,000 people will show up here, and all these other businesses can sprout up around there. So looking at the ancillary benefits, the downstream benefits, in addition to the direct benefits, and the state says, hey, this is a worthwhile investment for us as the state. And so to me, that mindset, you can apply that same logic to the early childhood and say, okay, well, there's going to be, if we put this money in here, there's a direct benefit in terms of the people that are going to be hired, and also the people who are able to then go work because they're not taking care of their kids. And then there's the downstream effect as well. So to me, that's the argument as to why the government should be doing something. Now, the level they should be doing it is difficult, because that's where you do need economists and all that to be looking at the numbers and so forth. But the idea that the government should be in, I think, is something that, based on all the other things the government does, is something that you can make a compelling case for. If it was me, yes, I think that things that produce more downstream benefit, that produce direct and downstream benefits, are things, those are the kinds of quote unquote investments that people in the private, you know, kind of privately look at and say, hey, where can I put my money where I can get more money in the future, or more benefit in the future? I look at this as one of those as well from a public standpoint. So yes, in my mind, the investment should be made in stuff like this, because this is the type of stuff that pays us back. For that reason alone, you can look at it selfishly. I can look at it altruistically and be like, oh, you know, no child deserves to be, you know, not be given these opportunities. So you can look at it like that as well. But I think there is actual concrete benefit to us as a society. You know, if you're still invested in an us, you know, if you're invested in an us, then this is something that would be something that's easy to get behind.
Yeah. Well, the shame is that divide and conquer has been a real theme in American
Well, I mean,
kind
I
of
could say
politics.
in
And so,
I could say in Earth politics.
well, yeah, but if you look at what I mentioned about certain European countries and even Asian countries, like China, we kind of look at some of these countries, China and India, and revere them for having all these, pumping out 500,000 engineers every year out of the university, whatever the numbers are. But they don't do that by accident. Is because, to your point, they have a collective vision for their own future of their country and of their system, and that involves teaching the kids from an early age. And we treat ourselves as Americans like crabs in a bucket, like literally. We pull each other down when we see others getting ahead and all that, because we've been conditioned in our country through the culture of racism and all that to have a zero-sum mentality. Like if money's going to those people over there, that somehow is taken away from me.
Yeah.
And that's how a lot of Americans just think about their fellow Americans. So
well, to be fair,
get rid of that thought process and say we're all in it together, which sounds hokey, but it's true.
Yeah.
Then we're gonna be.
Well, that's kind of the definition of a nation, if we're all going to be a part of the nation. I mean, but I've read a lot about this and observed a lot about this. Just America, like one of the things when you're looking at the European countries, for example, is a lot of times people talk about the Scandinavian countries and the quality of life being so high and education, being so high, healthcare being so, like things like that. And what some have observed is that it's easier a lot of times to get people to see their fellow citizenry as all on the same page, because they are more similar ethnically and everything like that, religiously more similar, like in a nation like the United States, which brings people from all over the world and people with all types of ethnicities, religions. We created the concept of race, things like that. Well, not Americans necessarily, but like this concept of race, which is a relatively new concept, but it's another way to divide people. To your point, America is uniquely, or at least it's substantially easy to divide relative to some other places in the world, at least in terms of the citizenry. So that's something at play, and that's a challenge that Americans would have to overcome if they want to build up the nation. If they want to build up the nation, then if you can be turned against your fellow American very easily, then it's going to be difficult to build up the nation. And that's not looking at just one thing. That's saying, look, if we all can't agree that we're trying to build this thing up, then it's really, if some people are trying to take it apart while others are trying to build it, then you can imagine how that would work out. But I do want to get to our second topic today. Second topic we wanted to discuss today. It was a really interesting article in Esquire, and it talked about masculinity being under assault, but it actually went back to like the first Esquire that was ever magazine, the first publication that they had, which was decades ago, which was one of the themes talked about there was masculinity being under assault. And it really kind of discussed how there's this this is like an evergreen thing to talk about in societies. And they're looking at American, society, in particular, but in general, it seems like this is evergreen, that you can always get out there and say that masculinity is under assault. And it's always, you can always be able to point to examples and things like that. And, people have a limited lifespan and so forth and living memory. So all of our perspectives are always going to be limited to what has been happening over the last 10, 20, whatever years at best. And so what was your reaction to reading this and kind of just seeing Americans over the decades always worried about masculinity and it being about to fall off of a cliff?
Yeah, this was great. It's just funny because the article did a good job at the beginning. It says, nobody younger than me wants to work. This isn't real music. Kind of everything
all
that
of
older
them
generations always say about younger generations. Like I got to hear from my friends and clients now about how bad millennials are and Gen Z and how they don't want to work. And it's the same thing we heard, in the 90s when we were kids coming up, and everyone calling us lazy and listening to gangster rap was going to turn our brain to mush. And it's all the same stuff. So I guess masculinity has the same type of shelf life where it's only good for that generation.
Yeah.
And everyone else behind is some kind of sissy now, not a real man.
Yeah.
So the best one was, almost certainly one of our founding fathers told his son, don't leave this house without your wig, stockings, and frock coat.
Yeah.
I didn't raise a sissy.
Yeah.
I'm seeing in my head a guy with a long wig and long stockings.
Or no, the guy
And the
that
dad
didn't want to
saying-
put on the wig, and the guy being
Yeah.
like, "What do you mean? You got to put on the?
Yeah,
Are you a
yeah,
real
I didn't-
man?
but-
Put on that
Yeah,
wig."
exactly. I didn't raise a sissy, put on a wig and stockings.
Yeah.
So that's what got me thinking about, because I wrote down, because it's funny that I mean, I printed the article here, not for the audience to see, but it's more to show the picture that I think that's Twisted Sister on the front, the lead singer. I see Mr. T, who, looking at him now, 4 years later, is an interesting depiction of a man with his little mini mohawk thing and all the gold chains, and he's a tough guy. And then I thought about, just in our lifetime, right? Remember Dennis Rodman 25 years ago, the way he was behaving?
Yeah.
Just marrying himself in a dress in Times Square. I thought about people like Little Richard, Prince, even Tupac had a little bit of femininity in how he was kind of moving sometimes. And that just made me think, though, and not to make fun of people, it just made me think that, yeah, like my whole life, I've been surrounded in our culture, not me personally, but just in the pop culture, like I say about Prince or Little Richard, there's always been men that have been on the spectrum of being a little bit on the feminine side and wondering what's going on. And then when we were kids, we had Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sylvester Stallone as kind of the macho guys, right? So I think this idea of men trying to figure themselves out, and because we're, in the end, there's a part of us that is a bit of the pack animal, trying to follow the alpha and who's the alpha in the culture, what are they doing, and who sets the tone. I think that's real, and it's just probably something that every generation deals with it.
That's what it is. That's exactly that was what my takeaway from this is, that the alpha, so to speak, societally kind of sets the tone for what the other men think, look at for masculinity. And there could be more than one alpha, obviously, in terms of large societies. We're not talking about if it's, a village of 150 people, it might just be one alpha, but talking large societies, and then with mass media, how that's broadcast. And so that sets the tone for what's masculine, so to speak. And from there, then it filters down, but then the next generation doesn't get that tone. They're getting the tone set by a next generation of who's setting that tone. And so it's kind of like just a perpetual disconnect between the different generations. And so the older generations, there are always going to be paranoid about what they view as masculinity fall into the wayside, because literally the next generation is going to have a either slightly or wildly different view of masculinity. And so to me, that's what we see here, is that it's just what masculinity is. I think mass media contributes to this. The more, the more different messages you see, the more it's going to scramble you up. But even if you put it in a village context, there's the alpha, and then there's a generation where they behave a certain way, and then the next generation is going to come up and they may behave 99% or 95% in the same way from a masculinity standpoint, but they may have some differences. And just the way the humans work, those differences, that's where everybody's going to focus on and say, oh, yeah, see the way you guys are doing that makes you guys sissies and whatever. And so, but the idea that it's a cycle, that it's a perpetual cycle, that men are constantly worried about this, their masculinity, the masculinity of the next generation and so forth, is just fascinating, and just that it's something that clearly is very important to men, which hey, that's great, but it's very important to men, but just the nature of the way that we tend to lack perspective because of the nature of our lifespans and, and living memory and so forth. It's this constant fight that's always hot. It's just like, wow, it can never be settled.
No, I know. And it probably, actually, you're right. And the conundrum there and the irony that it'll never be settled is probably because of men, right? How we're wired.
Yeah.
We're competitive. We want to be at the top, and that's what I mean. Like, all men serve certain traits. And that's the thing, is that, we don't want to conform to something of the past. Especially when you're a young man, right? You want to rebel. Like we talked about on a recent discussion on a totally separate topic, but we talked about like the civil rights era, right? There was the Black Panthers, the Nation of Islam, then there's Martin Luther King. And, Martin Luther King was the tortoise, and the other two groups were like the hare. They look a little more appealing to young men and all that. And
more masculine, to something like with guns, with like just the more aggressive posture.
But to actually be effective, it was a different type of masculinity that it took to see the goals through. And so I think that's the also the kind of the tension, I think, with men, right? Like, you're right, that especially when we're younger, there's a tendency to feel that kinetic strikes, that type of energy and physicality is really what is makes you a man. And I remember showing my son.
Well, but just real quick, let me because there's something about that though, just generational, in the sense that when the young man comes up, there is a certain point where the young man is tries to and is almost supposed to overtake the older man, so to speak, you know, like, and so, I mean, you and I say this in our mid 40s, like, you know, hold up, you know, we're not giving it up that easy, but that is a part of it, is that, you know, so the young man naturally is going to want to break out of that cage, so to speak, you know, and the way to break out, you know, implies, you know, that kind of kinetic kind of energy, you know, like where you're trying to break out of the chains, so to speak, that earlier generation put on you.
Yeah, and we were those young guys once, and thinking, like you're saying, now we're the middle-aged guys looking at the young guys coming up saying, whoa, what do you mean? I'm here. Like, I'm here doing this, and I did it for so long, and you trying to tell me now how to be a man, or how are you going to, and that might not be like a literal conversation, right? That might be the way that our generation now looks down at Gen Z or the millennials and saying, oh,
that's exactly what's happening. Yeah. And that's exactly the cycle that happened with us. And, you know, like that's what I mean. It's a perpetual cycle.
And that's what I mean and that's where I was going actually with the fact that as men, you know, and males, there's that tension, and that actually there's never going to be solving that until like humanity evolves out of that, which, you know, we're not going to be around to see that, and into something else, right? And who knows if that'll even is necessary or if it'll happen, because clearly we've survived this long evolutionary because it must have worked having men this way.
Well, I mean, the threat to this,
the pool of men.
Well, hold up. The threat to this would seem to be something like AI, you know, like some other type of thing that we create that's gonna then, you know, be a threat to us, you know, like it's. But as long as humans keep cycling through, it seems like this is the cycle. I mean, and this is something that's millions of years. Like if you look at it from a primate standpoint, like they have their kind of rituals and the kind of the cyclical way that the dominance and or like the interaction between the males go in their groups, you know, like different primates, you know, in the way that, you know, whether it be the apes, you know, or whatever, you know, like the gorillas, or, you know, chimpanzees or the orangutans, and different kind of things that go on with them. And so this is stuff that's hardwired, you know, when you look at it, you know, from the great ape standpoint. It's not just with humans where you have this kind of friction with we call it masculinity, but just in terms of the males, you know, like in the time. So, and that's not to say that there's nothing with females or there's not, but this is something that's very apparent with the males that we see, you know, and it seems to have something to do with the manhood aspect of it, you know, or the you know, so the male aspect.
And I think culture is important. And to your point, I mean, even as
but this stuff would be ingrained in the development of the culture also, though.
Well, that's what I'm saying is if you think about it, I mean, whether it's, you know, in the Jewish culture, a bar mitzvah at age 13, that's a kind of rite of passage. You know, the Maasai tribe in the Serengeti in Kenya, for example, at a certain age, a young man has to actually kill a lion with a spear, like go and hunt a lion. And if he fails, he doesn't come home, and if he succeeds, he's a man, right? And you know, we could even say our own little rituals in our culture. I'm thinking about like driving a car at 16, and that's why
going away to college, you know, things like that,
or drinking at 21, or when it was 18 to allow to drink. You know, there's all these milestones that say, hey, now if you get to this point and you can pass it, you're a bigger person, right? Or you're an adult, or you're a man.
And you have more responsibility because of that as well. Like you pass these milestones, and then you're supposed to have more responsibility, or, you know, and so forth.
Yeah, and I think, but during times like, again, and if we look at even just, and you know, just picking up the idea that when there's times of tension in a culture, from even the first conversation to this one, we see sometimes these desire for certain changes. And I think that right now, you made a good point. Because of the fracturing of our information through the internet and the media, social media, and the ecosystems in general, just in this last 15 years, it's kind of new for all of us. Now you've got people jockeying for, you know, a lot of attention and a lot of different silos of information, but one of them is, you know, masculinity. And I think, you know, I wrote down a few names, just like I had mentioned some of the artists maybe we grew up with that we're all over the spectrum and different types of, whether they're very macho, masculine guys like Schwarzenegger and Stallone, or they're more feminine guys like a Little Richard or Prince. Now I thought of some guys in today's culture and those who try and espouse masculinity, and they're different people. You know, I thought about Jordan Peterson, Tucker Carlson, Elon Musk, who's obviously, since he bought Twitter, has had a lot of opining on the subject, Andrew Tate. And then I thought about, you know, that's maybe our version of a certain form of male masculinity, masculine energy that's trying to get out and say, hey, you know, we're the ones who are going to tell you how to be a man. And then I thought of around the world, right? There's other cultures that take it to an even more extreme level. So we talked about education on kids. It made me think of the Taliban and how they're so extreme that we just learned this year, right? They banned all girls from going to school at any age. So it's not even like, well, you can learn to read and all that up until 6th grade or 12th grade, like some cultures do, but we just don't want you going to college and all that. Well, they're like, we don't want you learning anything.
Well, before you get too far away, I wanted to comment on, like what you said, like with current people who kind of part of their brand is, I'll show you how to be a man, or I'm about defending what it is to be a man and so forth. And the interesting thing about that is it's almost an inverse in a sense. It's a further evolution, but the where you pointed out with like a Schwarzenegger or something like that, that was like, because at that time it was a mass media environment. He was he was a broadcast to, across the board. Like people would know about who he was, no matter where you were, Terminator, I'll be back, all that kind of stuff. Like that was something that everybody knew. But the names you just mentioned, in many respects, there are many people who don't really either don't know who those people are, or who aren't really familiar with their work. And the reason for that is that while we have a mass media distribution system, information is much more siloed. So now what's evolving now is, instead of society-wide, a lot of times, quote unquote, alphas that set the tone for what masculinity can be, what we're seeing now a lot of times is siloed. So you have certain people that are like, this is what, like, they got incels in one respects, like, yeah, this is what masculinity is. And on the other hand, you'll see other people that look at masculinity as something totally different. And so it's more, in a sense, village sense, but it's all happening in through this same conduit, which is the internet, where you just have all these silos popping up with all these different ideas of masculinity. And that's a new thing, so to speak, that we're going to see how that unfolds and what effects that has. So, but I mean, this is something, like I said, it's a perpetual conversation. And so, I mean, it's not something that will end at any point, but it's interesting to observe, in the sense that, again, need males and that interaction between males. And I thought you used a good word when you said communal, and just kind of like, there is a definite communal feedback going on with males that is distinct and observable, that, and there's interesting stuff going on, and the cyclical nature of it makes it even more interesting. But yeah,
maybe I'll go get a kilt and start playing a bagpipe in a dress, and we'll see how that.
Hey man, do what you got to do, man. You got to express your masculinity how you can. All right. So, but we can get out of here from there, man. We appreciate everybody for joining us on this episode of Call Like I See It. Subscribe to the podcast, rate it, review us, tell us what you think. Send it to a friend. Until next time, I'm James Keys.
I'm Tunde Ogunlana.
All right. We'll talk to you next time.